Hi, my name is Ben, and welcome to Field Foley episode 3. My guest today is Jess Riley French. He's a sound artist from Yorkshire who runs workshops and lectures on his art practices. He has a passion for capturing the overlooked details of life through his recorded work and creative output, which focuses on themes of audible silence, active listening, and stillness. For exploring these themes, he develops and builds specialized microphones, which have been widely used in all areas of sound culture. So, Jess, welcome and thanks for taking your time.
Oh, thanks for the invite.
So, the first thing I'd always like to ask my guests is, why did you record your first sound and what was it?
Okay, so I was given a little cassette recorder by my mother for, I think, my 12th or 13th birthday. I think it was my 12th birthday, a long time ago now. Mainly for recording like radio programs, and also I was given a guitar as well, so to record myself practicing. But the first kind of field recording, if you like, was I was listening back to one of the radio programs the next day in the garden, and it was one of those cassette recorders where the record and the play button were kind of right next to each other. So I pressed record instead of play by mistake, and I didn't realise for about five or so minutes, because suddenly there was no music coming out. But because I was so young, I didn't kind of think, oh, I've messed that tape up. I actually listened back straight away to the recording just to see what I'd recorded, thinking it would just record me running about the garden or whatever I was doing. But of course, as probably most people listening to this program know, when you record through a microphone, any kind of microphone, even if it's a little one on a cassette recorder, you hear things that you didn't hear with your ears, because we filter out so much.
Yeah.
So I was hearing all these sounds, all these kind of sounds of gardens several houses away, and rumbles and things. That I said, "What's that?" So, and again, I was so young that I just kind of didn't differentiate between that and the music that should have been on the cassette. And I think that was important for me because I didn't start thinking of them as two different practices at that time when I was so young. So I didn't filter it out as like, oh, that's just noise or sound, and that's music, So that was the first accidental field recording, if you like. Well, I didn't know that's what it was called then,
Yeah, of course. And that's very interesting. So you went into field recording right away. So you didn't came to it via music, or let me ask you this way: what was your next steps, your journey after that to go into field recording?
No, I didn't know anything about it. So I just carried that little tape recorder around and would record other things other than music. Didn't really have any understanding. I mean, this was the early days of punk and new wave. So my musical knowledge was fairly limited to those fields, and obviously pop culture, because that's everywhere, and a little bit of classical. And it wasn't really until, I suppose I probably heard some field recordings on programs like John Peel when he was playing maybe some industrial music, early industrial music, or music concrete, things like that. But I didn't really connect that to what I was doing because I was too young, really. I think it wasn't until maybe 1981, 82, when I really started to understand that there was this practice out there of people using field recordings or found sound to create work. And again, this is the days before the internet, so my access to that material was quite limited. And I didn't grow up in a big city. I grew up in just outside quite a small kind of provincial town in the UK, or city in the UK, but so there wasn't much access in terms of other people doing it or record shops that stocked it. So it was quite limited.
Why did you decide then to build your own microphones? Did this came much later, or was it like the exploration phase already?
I think I was 14 or 15. I went to see a band called Crass, who were like an anarchist punk group. I actually went to see the support act, which was Annie Anxiety, Little Annie, as she's now known. We did an amazing set just with radios and a voice, which was just fantastic. I'd never seen anything like that. It was amazing. And a group called Poison Girls. But anyway, they were selling various publications, which they used to do at their gigs, lots of anarchist kind of books and things like that. And I bought one, like a newspaper, anarchist newspaper, which was mainly music focused. In the back of that, it had a build your own guitar pickup thing, which is a very primitive piezo element based guitar pickup. So I thought, I'll have a go at that. So I built that because by that time I was playing zithers. I got into playing zithers for some bizarre reason. I can't remember why. I think it's because it was the little sort of toy zither was the cheapest thing in the music shop, and I thought I'm going to go and buy an instrument. So I bought this little German toy, bright red toy zither, which I've still got. Anyway, so I decided to build one to amplify the zithers, and that was my first one. Really super primitive and really, not a very good sound. But a key moment for me was I decided to record this was outside because of this fascination with the outside still. And I was faffing around with my cables, trying to plug the cable into the recorder and set everything up. And I just hung the cable on a fence. It was near a church, and there was a fence around this church's land. And I just hung it on this fence. And it kind of half slipped off, so the element was touching the wire of the fence, and it was plugged into my tape recorder, and I had my headphones in, so I suddenly heard this kind of tone coming from this wire, and I thought, oh my God, that's better than what I was going to do with the zither. So that was my first kind of abstract contact mic recording, if you like. And then I just decided to, I faffed around with those very primitive DIY designs for a few years. It wasn't until I was, I think, 16 or 17 that I kind of started to build a bit better ones, kind of more stable ones.
Mm-hmm. Your journey in the microphones is what actually brought me to you, because the first thing I heard about you was the contact microphones over some crazy journey. But then I got into your microphones, and the first time I held it in my hand, it was really like a world opened up for me, because in the beginning I was always going out with the intention of recording something, any special place or any noise, and then you had the sound pollution, and you had anything like a plane flying overwards, and I was really frustrated. But with going into like the contact microphones, I found that, as you also said in some of your lectures and your videos, you can always find something interesting if you are open to it. What interests me is your practice of durational listening, of really staying in a place for multiple hours. How did you come to that? Is it like, did it evolve naturally, or did you just decide to look if the sound would change at all, something like that?
Well, I think there's two things. I was always really fascinated with the listening rather than the sound collecting. Like I said, when I was quite young, when I did start to meet other people who were into sound, rather than pure music, and with all respect to them, they were a very particular type of guy. Usually, we all know them. The kind of sound geek guys who are quite. Well, yeah, there are. I mean, it's better now, but back in the 80s, let me tell you, it was incredibly sexist, and I was already kind of rebelling against various traits of male gender. So I was kind of put off the whole sound collecting thing. But the thing with contact mics, which led me, because it was contact mics really that led me into the durational listening in one sense, is that you can't predict what you're going to hear. We can't when we go out with our ears or with normal microphones either. But this culture of sound has kind of subliminally taught us that we think we can predict it. And I think that's one of the kind of major lessons in field recording, field practice, if you like, is to get over that hurdle of, if you go out with an intention, that's kind of the wrong approach, because you can't control what's out there. But anyway, in my early 20s, I was working in the music industry, and me and my then partner in life and in business decided to set up our own distribution company. So I couldn't do much sort of field recording for a long time. I was still busy with that. And it wasn't until around 1999, we decided to sell that company for personal reasons, including the fact that my mother had become very ill and sadly passed away. So it was just time to do something else. And I'm not keen on the kind of idea that field listening or whatever is always like therapeutic. But at that time in my life, I needed something that made me stop. Do you know what I mean? Just physically stop. And field recording is great for that, because unless you want yourself in the recording, you have to be quite still.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the years after that, a couple of years after that, so 2000, 2001, that I noticed that I was just listening to one thing or one space, and it was getting longer and longer. I was enjoying it more and more and more, and crucially, hearing more and more and more. Because the longer you listen, the more your sort of subconscious filters start to fade away, and you start to actually hear what's there rather than what you think is there. So it was that period, 2000 onwards, where I got quite heavily into stretching the duration of how long I listened for. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's really nice. And to connect with that, how did you come up with the idea of rigging up like an actual physical place? Of course, thinking of things like the Tate Modern, where you rigged up the whole museum and stayed in there for several nights to record its essence, so to say. How did that come about?
I've always been quite interested in architecture. So I was kind of, once I started recording and could spend a decent amount of time on it, which I did as well in my teens and early 20s, but once I could get into buildings and get access to them, it was just natural for me to think, well, I want to hear what this building sounds like, not just the kind of people in it or the ambient spaces, if you like, but I want to hear the structure of the building. So that was quite natural to me. It was something I always wanted to do, but when I was younger, I didn't have the technology. I mean, that's the other thing that's, and again, anybody listening will know, is that the advances in the technology have been amazing in terms of recorders. When I was in my teens and early 20s, I was still working with cassette recorders or small reel-to-reel recorders, which were great for some things and still are. They're still good for some things. But if you want to record structural vibration, which is often, relatively speaking, a very low level, in terms of intensity for recorders, volume-wise, and decibel level, then you do need really quite powerful and quiet preamplifiers. So it wasn't until, I think the first building I did was actually Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, which is it used to be 3 cottages, but the owners knocked it into one house, and it's now a museum. And that had a personal resonance for me, that place. I used to visit there quite often, including with my mum. So I wanted to get access to there and just record that building. That was the first audible silence work, if you like, where I was recording the entire building moving and resonating. So it was something I always wanted to do, and it was that thing of having access, having some kind of career, or because that's another change really. Back in the sort of early 2000s, even, it was quite hard to get access to a public building unless you were somebody. And I wasn't particularly known for that, but I was known in the music industry, and I knew a few people at Kettle's Yard because they run a music program as well. So I had an in, if you see what I mean. Now it's different. Most institutions are quite open to young artists coming forward with ideas, but back then it was quite it was quite tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I'm having also problems with some places I would love to record, but they are quite strict about.
Oh yeah, it's
people,
still. I mean, it's. I don't know if it's global, but I think it's going backwards now. Because of security and all kinds of other things. But there was like a golden period when sound art and field recording were becoming much more sort of present and I say popular, but well known, shall we say, to organisations, that they were kind of interested and up for it. But I mean, probably they get swamped with requests for people to come in now and say, "Can I stick a contact mic on your boiler?" Whatever. Yeah.
Could you maybe walk us through how you set like a building up? If you go in there, how do you choose where to put and what microphones to use? Do you have like your standard kit every time, or do you like choose it based on location? What's your process there?
Obviously, it depends quite a lot on what access I can get. If I have sort of decent access over a number of days, then I tend to spend the first day just kind of experimenting. I never go in with an idea, even though I've recorded lots of buildings now. I never go in thinking, I know where I'm going to put those microphones. I think that's a big mistake, because you miss out on those kind of happy accidents and that kind of, and also I think for the motivational thing, for me, it's about that kind of exciting discovery. So if I'm predicting what I think I'm going to do, then that lessens a bit. I like just kind of wandering around as if I'm doing it for the first time in a way, just trying microphones in different places and also listening to the building with my ears and just kind of observing it in a different way. It's like when I did the tape building, for example, that's a building that I've been to lots of times, but when you know you've got access to it 24 hours a day, you perceive it differently. You kind of observe it differently. So the first day I'll spend experimenting if I've got the time and trying different things. And I do always carry my little kit with me, my sort of basic standard kit, if you like. It fits in a photographer's backpack, side backpack. If I'm doing a building, then obviously sometimes I'm using lots of microphones. So I'll bring a case with me with lots of different microphones, contact microphones mainly, some small DPA microphones which I like to use. A Sanken microphone sometimes, and also I'll bring coils and ultrasonic detectors and things that will pick up other frequencies like the lighting systems or things like that. Oh, and geophones. I use industrial geophones, which I've adapted as well.
Yeah, I've read that on your webpage that you're currently experimenting with those types. Maybe on that topic, do you have any plans for future new microphones you will be able maybe to sell? Especially, of course, I'm interested in the geophones because I've started playing around with the LOM Audio one, which I think are already familiar with, but I really like to go into more like the scientific equipment stuff. But the thing I can find, as you already mentioned on your site, it's scientific equipment, so it's very expensive, and it's also probably not easy to get the sound out of there.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean I don't have a plan at the moment to do a version of the ones I use myself because it's a long process to adapt them. It's really fiddly and they're not particularly stable. I mean, I've gone through with my contact mics, the C-series contact mics, I'm still using a pair I built about 10, 12 years ago. So they're really stable and really durable. With the geophones that I'm adapting, I've gone through maybe 10 in the last 5 or 6 years. I've still got them, they still work, but the way you adapt them is kind of quite unstable and quite delicate. So there's that aspect. The other aspect is, and I'm aware of 2 manufacturers now who are selling geophones to the public. I won't name them, but the thing is, we can't record below 10 hertz with our digital recorders anywhere. They all have an inbuilt limiter. You have to hack the recorder, which is not something I would recommend people do. I'm lucky I had a hack that the builder of the recorders that I use had for mainly for natural history units who wanted to record like elephant calls, which are often in the infrasonic range. So they built a software hack specifically for that, and I managed to get that. They don't issue it anymore, and they never issued it publicly. It was just like a private thing for a few people, which I just happened to persuade them to give me. Which is a real shame. I don't think there's any reason why recorders have that 10 hertz. I think it's purely like a legislation thing in terms of what might hurt somebody's ears or might damage the equipment in theory, but not in practice. So we can't record below 10 hertz. So with the C-series contact mics, they can get down to 13 hertz. So there's those extra 3 hertz. There's no real benefit to releasing a geophone, which would cost, it would be expensive because most people will not be able to record infrasound with it. You may as well use a C-series microphone with a decent recorder and then use some software to kind of extract the lower frequencies from that.
Yeah,
that's my thinking. I could release something. I know there's a hunger for it. And this comes to like an ethical thing as well I've been asked, hundreds of times to sell geophones. And I don't feel comfortable doing that when I know that they're not particularly stable and that the recordists won't be able to record infrasound with them. It's kind of, unless they've got a hack as well.
Yeah. So it's like a niche of a niche of a niche. It's like a really, really long way down the chain. Yeah. So maybe besides geophones, any other parts that you're interested in recording? I mean, is there anything left?
Probably. I'm sure there is.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't, like, for example, there's VLF, which is the sort of radio frequency fallout of events in the ionosphere.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other people making VLF receivers, so I'm not somebody who thinks, if somebody else is doing it and doing it well, like Steve McGreary, who makes VLF receivers, and there's an Italian company whose name I've forgotten who make them, and they're very good. So I'm not going to try and nick their business. I don't do that. I think there's an ethical point to that. Same with ultrasonic detectors. For infrasound, there are great people making infrasound detectors. Like, I don't want to make another one that will impact their business. They're nice people.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in terms of what else is out there, yeah, I mean, the stuff with hydrophones is interesting. I make kind of hydrophones that are a reasonable price for most people, and they're calibrated for freshwater and saltwater.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of deep sea hydrophone, there are some interesting results starting to appear around sort of ultrasonics and infrasonics in hydrophone technology. But again, because you're talking about deep oceans and a lot of pressure, on the capsules, I think that'll remain the preserve of scientific manufacturers, because they're heavy, they're expensive, and the amount of testing you need on them and government approval is quite intense.
Yeah, and then there's also like the whole logistics of getting out there in the ocean and getting a microphone deep enough to get something.
Exactly, yeah.
And yeah, then we also start to get into like the ethical territory of, is it like a good idea morally or ethically to go out there and disturb like deep sea creatures?
Yeah, I've always been interested in this, actually, because when I first started to meet, and it wasn't for a long time, when I met anybody else who was interested in field recording, I met a few experimental musicians who were doing it around Yorkshire.
Mm-hmm.
But the first time I met somebody who called himself a field recordist, they were definitely a nature recordist and only interested in birds. You know what I mean? It was that kind of, field recording meets birds. And I started to have questions then of what's happening here on an ethical, or I don't even think I thought about it in an ethical sense because I was too young. I was just thinking about, you've already decided what's there before you get there, and that kind of question, that initial question, got me to think about other things, like, for example, going out to environments and disturbing them. And of course, I think these conversations are fascinating, but they go full circle, because for a long time there was this kind of idea of, well, you must wear camouflage, you must try not to disturb the natural world. You put your recorder and your microphones and you walk back, or you work on long cables, hundreds of meters away. The truth is firstly, all the other species, they know we're there or have been there. We cannot hide from them.
Yeah.
The other thing is some of them don't even care or don't even perceive us in that sense. So I always find it quite funny when bird watchers have all this kind of really expensive clothing to make them invisible. The birds know they're there. You can walk in bright, luminous pink. It's not going to make any difference. They'll still know you're there. They're much cleverer than we are, most species. But yeah, we have to think about that more and more. I can't go into the details, but there was a recent situation in the arts with an artist which brought up lots of ethical questions. And what I found fascinating about that discussion, which involved the organisation they were working with, was how creaky and how still, how can I put it, under-resourced the ethical discussions can be. And I'm not blaming anybody for that. I think there are structural issues in organisations and the arts in general. But ethical discussions, which we think of now as being fine and totally out there, there's ethical. You can find conferences and everything about every aspect of what we do. But the actual practical mechanics of how we deal with ethical issues is a little bit creaky still, which is surprising.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I'm trying to. I mean, in the beginning, people used to tell each other, if you go out in nature, leave it as you find it. So don't leave any trash around. But I think we will have to adapt and change, and maybe take trash bags with us. And if you're out there recording, maybe just take some trash out there with us to make it better. That might leave a better impression on that. But I mean, yeah, that's all very like small things, simple people can do. But yeah, on a grand scale, it's interesting because, as you said, ethically, also with like building stuff, sourcing materials, you mentioned on your website as well, it's not easy to find out where all that stuff has come from and how to get like a real, get a real insight into the whole chain of it. So
it's quite a dilemma. I mean, if you think, I think most people who do field recording to any sort of extent are people who also care about the environment. But probably one of the largest impacts they're going to have is the equipment that they take out there, because a lot of it involves metals and rare metals and plastics. So really the best thing we can do to the environment is to stop what we're doing immediately.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's the other thing is, of course, is that field recording has gone a long way to contributing to awareness of environmental damage. It still has that role, which is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. There are people out there like I think Bernie Krause was his name, who are recording different environments like every year and showing the progress of how the sound changes, how animals get quieter, how we impact that directly, which is, I think, a very important work, and it's very easy to convey to people because you can show it to them. You can say, listen to this recording 5 years ago and to this now, and to this and to this, and you really feel the decline. So,
and there's lots of work kind of by people with less public profile, sort of sound ecologists and ecoacoustics people in universities who are doing that great work of exploring, sort of doing sort of deep data gathering of environments, and using things like contact mics and hydrophones, and that's changed massively in the last 10, 15 years. The access we have now to insect life through using contact mics or hydrophones. I mean, I suppose going back to what you said earlier about what's next is one of the things that I do a lot, which I think is growing in sort of interest with other recorders, is I do a lot of plant recording and also soil recording, which I adapt contact mics and hydrophones for that. And that's a kind of growing area of interest. I notice a lot more sort of academics now doing surveys on soil, soil vibration and things like that. So that's probably a big thing. And plant recording, recording the insides, the internal sort of systems of plants. That's an interesting field as well.
That's a very, very interesting part. So how do you approach this? Do you go by it with like scientific equipment and then translate it into sound, or do you use, like, as you said before, like ultrasonic stuff? Because I have no idea about insides of plants. But it fascinates me right away. So,
well, I use my C series contact mics and my D series hydrophones, and sometimes I adapt them. So I attach various probes to them. Again, it's quite a sort of delicate job sometimes. And of course, bringing back the ethical thing, you have to get permission and you have to be careful because you can't go around sticking probes in plants if it's going to kill them. That would be a defining point. But sometimes you're digging down into the root systems and accessing like larger trees that way and things like that. There's various ways. I mean, people have done it for a long time. Like scientists have done it. Usually by attaching sensors which pick up kind of electromagnetic signals. And of course, I'm sure a lot of people will be aware there are various musical devices that do that, where you can attach a sensor and it's kind of sonified and plays like nice twinkly music of plants. But the actual,
I always found this interesting, but it didn't translate for me like the essence of what it would sound like, because it was more, for me, it was more like it maybe measures like the wetness of the plant, or maybe some kind of electricity, and then tries to emulate a sound out of that, or translate it to some values. But
Mm.
I've always found it kind of detached of the plant itself, because you can also put it on your hands.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid musical. I mean, I'm not against that. It's a valid musical thing to do.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, but what I'm saying is the actual sounds of plants are fantastic and amazing too. You know, they're actually just as beautiful, or whatever you want to think of. I mean, the beauty is a problematic word in this sense as well, but they're just as captivating as that kind of, you know, sonified version of a plant signal. They're for me, they're more so. You know, but yeah, like I think that's one of those kind of basic things with field recording is. You know, you can have people composing music that's supposed to evoke nature. Nature doesn't need evoking. It's fantastic and amazing and beautiful and powerful and terrifying and whatever. It's all out there. It's just you have to listen. That's the thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And with going into this topic of the environment, how did, in your experience, the environmental sound overall changed over the years? I mean, of course, it became louder, but do you perceive it as just louder or maybe also different? And is there also maybe a trend that it goes backwards now with like battery vehicles, electrical vehicles, and stuff hopefully getting less sound polluted in the future?
Um, well, I mean, I was never that much of a nature recordist, so lots of my recording was and still is in urban environments. And again, because I was using unconventional microphones, I wasn't sort of as focused on the ambient sound in a way. So I haven't really perceived huge differences in that sense. It's been fairly constant, or that's what my memory says. I mean, I'm sure if I went back in time to when I was 13 or 14, there'd obviously been far less cars on the road. You know, quite obviously.
Hmm.
Back when I was young, if a family was lucky, they had one car. Now, you know, just on the street I'm on, there are houses with 3 or 4 cars. You know, it's ridiculous. So there are obviously more cars on the road, more flights. You know, there's obviously been a change. But I think it's like a lot of things. If it's a slow change, it's one of the dangers. When it's a slow change, we don't notice it. You know, we just become accustomed to it slowly increasing, and we don't really notice it. Which is why some of that work that you mentioned, like Bernie Krause's work, comparing recordings from a few years ago to now, that's why that's important.
Yeah.
Generally we don't notice it. In terms of electrical cars and things like that, I mean, I think they're quite interesting. I mean, I know I think within 5 years, electric cars will sound more or less the same as petrol cars, because there's this great move to put artificial sounds back in them.
No, hopefully not.
Well, it's happening. They don't have a car engine sound, but the sound that they're producing isn't just what's actually been produced. It's a fake sound being emanated, because people were concerned that people wouldn't hear them coming, things like that. So that's interesting. But of course, for other species, none of this matters. You know, the sound pollution, you know, is there with electrical cars as much as it is with petrol cars. You know, because it's about vibrations and electromagnetics and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So the more charging points there are, we haven't really explored that properly yet. The more charging points there are, the more that interferes with bird migration paths, because they do, some birds and bats and things like, and some insects use electromagnetic fields to sort of navigate by. So we haven't really thought about that enough. You know, I'm sure some people have. Whether or not they've taken notice of it, or whether governments have suppressed it, I don't know. But there's all that kind of stuff we've got to get into.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's also very hard to convey to people if you can't show them like examples of, especially with the contact microphones. I found it always easy to to impress people, or maybe not like impress, maybe give them a sense of how much sound there is out there that we can't hear, and yeah, also like you mentioned, also that this all affects nature around us, and
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, especially when I'm maybe doing a workshop with people who've not done much field recording, they haven't used a contact mic before. It's that kind of, oh my god kind of moment. There's so much more there, and that feeds into when we're listening just with our ears, because the contact mics allow us to realise that there is so much more there than we think there is. And that's kind of one of the wonderful things about these technologies, is that they do open up our ears and our minds to just how narrow our species has become in terms of how we think about sound. We're incredibly dumb as a species.
Yeah.
I often say this, in talks as a kind of joke, but any other species, if they get together and decide to wipe us out, they could do it, because we're so dumb. Like a cow could meander up behind us without us even hearing it and bash us over the head, and we wouldn't realise until it was too late. So the first species that decides they want us out of here, and we're gone.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, maybe connecting on that part with giving lectures, maybe we can get a bit on the topic of tips for newcomers. Do you maybe remember what you struggled with the most starting out and how you overcome it? Like, was there technical issues, or I don't know, maybe not having the right kit with you and you thinking, oh, man, I should have packed that every time?
There are things like that. I think it's tricky, because I'm now a few decades on, so my understanding now will be different to when I was there. But I think there's two things. It's one is you can have too much equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Like don't get obsessed with the technology. I mean, do if you want to, but don't assume that will solve anything for you. And especially if you're approaching field recording from a creative point of view, like whether it's music or sound art, it's buying every microphone type and the best recorder will not make good work. That's
Mm-hmm.
just like the most expensive paintbrush in the world will not guarantee you're going to paint a great painting. It's what you do with it, and it's how you think about it that matters. So there's that. There are some basics for somebody who wants to get started. Is I would say, if you haven't got a large budget, don't wait to save up to buy a really good recorder. Buy one that you can afford. As long as it's halfway decent. I've tried to avoid those really tiny sort of dictaphone ones, if you can. Especially if you want to do creative field recording, buy one that at least has a few different inputs, so you can plug different microphones in and get started. Because it's doing that is the great educator, and it's doing it. And I think also, don't get too obsessed with kind of trying to reproduce what you've already heard other people doing. I think that's a big mistake. I was lucky in that I discovered it when I didn't really have any of those kind of reference points. I wasn't trying to think, oh, I want to make a piece of music concrete, like insert any name. I was just messing around basically, and kind of experimenting, and I think that's really important. So yeah, just get started. I do carry around my sort of basic kit, which has recorder, batteries, contact mics, hydrophones, and some small omni microphones. That's probably the one thing I would say is, if you want to buy normal ambient microphones that capture sound as normally, don't get a shotgun microphone, because that's often what people come out of colleges or school education with, thinking they've got to get a shotgun microphone. Shotgun microphones are really specific, and they have very specific purposes. If you just want to capture sort of soundscapes and lots of different types of environment, get a small pair of omnis. Some of the tiny ones, like that you can see sort of attached to people on the news, those tiny lapel kind of size microphones. A small pair of omnis will be the most valuable bit of kit in terms of normal microphones, I think. Yeah, and then just start doing it.
Yeah, just putting in the work and the time and experimenting. I think that's something I always hear with people telling newcomers in the field, that just get like the thing you can afford and get out there, because it's all about the practice and about feeling, learning.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned time there. I mean, time is a really valuable thing, and
Yeah.
more and more of us don't have much time with the financial pressures that we've got. But I think another tip maybe is don't think of it's again breaking down this idea of what sound is and what nature is. If you're interested in environments, for example, don't think, oh, I'll have to wait until the weekend until I can go, get in my car or get on a train or a bus, whatever, and go to wherever. Record everywhere. If you're at work, record. Obviously bearing in mind the people you're working with might not want to be recorded, but record everywhere. Record your house. Record. Open the windows if it's warm and just record out of the windows. It's about the listening. The listening matters. That's the way to access environments is through the listening.
Yeah. Yeah, on that part, is there like any location you have in mind that you always wanted to record but didn't get the chance yet? Any special place?
I used to have those kind of lists in my head. It's one of the things I've learned to get rid of, because it builds up so many sort of preconceptions and like Kettle's Yard, for example, was one I always wanted to record. So I recognise now, if I listen back to the archive of recordings, I recognise that I definitely arrived there with some ideas of what I was going to record,
Mm-hmm.
and I try as hard as I can not to do that now. The only thing I would say is I have a favourite country, which is Japan. I've always been obsessed with lots of aspects of Japanese culture. So put me anywhere in Japan. I don't care where it is, and I'll be happy with my microphones or without them. I'm just happy to be there.
Just listening.
Yeah. So I don't have that kind of. I'm not a sound spotter, so I don't unless I've got a commission, which is maybe a specific building or location. If it's just me, because I think the important thing to say about my work, if you like, if you call it work, is I'd do it even if there was no outlet for it. I like listening through microphones, so that's what I like doing. But I just like to go wherever, and sometimes I'll listen with my ears. Sometimes I'll get some microphones out, and quite often I'll listen, and I won't press record. It's not about capturing it; it's about the listening. So quite often I'll listen for hours to something, and it might be something that's amazing, but I won't press record because I don't feel that need to always collect everything.
Yeah, that's very interesting indeed. And did you ever have a moment where after you like really wished you had pressed record, or is it like the experience is with you and that was enough for it?
The second one is what I like to believe. It always happens. That's what I'm aiming for. So if I'm trying to present myself as some kind of mystical person, I'll say, "Oh yes, let it go." But obviously, there'll be times when I think, "Oh, yeah, I'd like to hear that again," or "Why wasn't I recording when that happened?" or whatever.
Yeah.
But most of the time, no, I'm quite happy to leave stuff. I think it's informed my listening. I think I'm a better listener because I don't collect everything. I think if you're always focused on collecting things, then however much you try, there'll be a part of your brain which is focused on: is it recording? Is it are the batteries running out? Are the levels okay?
Are the levels right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm quite okay. I'm quite happy. I think it's really important to let some stuff go. I think it can help you practice. But having said that, now you've asked that question, if I try and think hard right now off the top of my head of anything I've listened to where I think I wish I'd recorded that, I can't think of anything. The only things I can think of is I really wish I had more recordings of my mum, speaking and just generally, and my daughter when she was younger. I wish I had tons and tons of recordings of those things.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I have a young daughter, and I have some recordings of her already in of the young ages because, of course, as like a sound designer, it was my goal to get some kind of those laughs and for example, what I find really interesting is how the voice and the laughing and everything changes over time, which is interesting to me. So. But I'm definitely, I have some moments where I was like, I wish I recorded that, but then I also was like, I experienced it and it's for me and it's fine.
Exactly,
I don't need to share it with other people. So
yeah.
Okay. I think I'm all out of questions. So if you have anything, maybe you want to promote anything you want to shout out, feel free.
I don't think so. I think one thing, I'm in the middle of I'm in the middle of research. I've been researching this since I was a teenager, but I've always been quite interested in the gendering of sound, and that's now much more discussed, which is really healthy. But the history of field recording in that respect is still really problematic. So if you look at something like Alan Lomax, the Alan Lomax archives, they're not the Alan Lomax archives. there were the names of about 15 women who were always doing the recordings, always the researchers, whose names should be on that archive.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look back at the history of field recording, if you Google it, for example, you'll hear a few the usual names, Ludwig Koch, all these kind of names, almost all male. The actual history, if you start to delve into it, if you look back to the late 1800s, it was massively female dominated, massively so. So I'm in the middle of, I'm researching that. It's a lifelong work, but I'm trying to write a book on it, but it's taking a while. But I think this stuff matters. So in terms of what you were saying about tips for people just starting, I think it's important to question the history as part of your practice. If you're interested in using it in a creative sense, because if you just go in there thinking it's all about these male names, and that extends right up to composers and early sound artists, whether it's John Cage or whoever you want to put in that barrel. Again, all massively female dominated. The actual reality was female dominated throughout. So it's really important. Throw away those male names. Go find the female names who are now, thankfully, starting to be much more present. Sound art, for example, the first piece of sound art wasn't 1976. It was in the 50s by Atsuko Tanaka, the Japanese artist. Find these references because it matters, because it's all about questioning. And when we listen, we have to constantly question what we're hearing. So you have to question the histories as well. I think it's really important, super important.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I see that more and more in the current future, and it's interesting to me because I come from an IT background, and in programming there was also always like it was thought of as a male space and a male dominated space, and there are all these great programmers. But then there were so many people that contributed to it over the years, and it came to the surface, and people are getting aware of it, and it's very interesting to see. For example, Joan Clark, who broke the code, the Enigma code in World War II, was a famous example, and there are others as well. And it's always also my always was my place to show that it's a job that anyone can do, and it's not gender specific, and it's important to break those stereotypes when you come to them, and people start to talk about in a way that makes you feel like they think that's a job only men can do. It really riles me up.
Yeah, and the thing is, it wasn't a job that was even invented by men. It was invented by women. It's just that, I mean, historically speaking, and still sadly now, the male of our species are colonizers. We see a space, we go in and we dominate it. That's unfortunately, that's the history of our gender. So, I mean, Foley, for example, I know it carries the name of a male person, but the early people who were doing what became known as Foley were female because the studio engineers had become. I mean, I've been digging into some of that history for a section of this book in terms of studio engineers. If you look back to the early days of phonogram recording and sort of wax cylinder recording, and when it started to become studio based, so much of it was females doing the work. But they weren't allowed to be named because they weren't allowed to be in the unions. It was the unions that were a problem. They wouldn't let them join the unions, so they had to have a male name on the sort of credits and things like that. So often they would just get somebody in the management and call him the studio engineer because it had to have a name of the studio engineer. It had to be male, but it was women doing it. So Foley was the same. Lots of the people making the sound in studios for early sort of radio and things like that were women. It's just they weren't allowed to have the names on the production because they weren't in the union. It's really sad, So it shouldn't even be called Foley. I don't know who the first one was. I haven't found out yet, but it should have that name, really.
Yeah, that's
and I
very
know
interesting.
we've just had an anniversary of the vinyl record, haven't we? And just been reading about. I've just forgotten the name actually. I think it's the first name, last name was Killick. But she designed the diamond stylus, which completely changed how we still listen nowadays to records. And she was ripped off by Pi Records, and she fought them in the law courts and won. And then they refused to pay, and she died in poverty. And so if we're listening to music, any of your listeners, when we listen to our music on vinyl, if we still have a vinyl player, you know, and all music progression, because it was all linked to that. It's all down to women, really, you know, and it's just so sad that we're still, the change is there, it's happening, but it's still glacial sometimes, you know.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's always the case. We humans are very slow to adapt to anything. I mean, it's on a personal level. If you try to adapt a new practice or try to live healthy or something like that, that can take years. And if you think on a global scale, it's probably been, it has to be like hundreds of years until that changed. But it's a really important topic, and I'm really looking forward to the book. And it's interesting.
Well, it might never come out. I'm a terrible writer. I need a lot. I think I'm dyslexic. I never had tested, but I have a kind of form of dyslexia. So writing
maybe
takes
make an
me
audiobook.
a long. Just me rambling on for hours and hours, getting angry and angry. I was like,
there might be an audience for that. I mean, I would listen to it for a couple of hours.
Well, I think just to sort of put a slightly light-hearted twist, I think one of the problems with this book is I think the history of women in field recording shouldn't be written by a white man.
Oh yeah, that's also problematic. So you'll have to find another writer that gets the name on the book as well. But I think that's really important work to get into that, and then to also promote that that this is actually what happened, to try to somewhat correct the written history.
Yeah, I've decided I'll start sharing some of the names on, like putting little profiles up on social media of who some of these people were. Some of them are quite well known in certain sections, like folk music. Maud Carples, for example, is quite well known to folk musicians because of the collections that she, of manuscripts. But outside of that, lots of those early folk tradition collectors are really super important. It's just they don't have the same status as somebody like Lomax, and they should have. They absolutely should have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. So looking forward to those insights into that. I'm happy to link it in the episode as well.
Thanks.
Thank you again for your time. It was really nice talking to you. And
no problem. Thank you. Yeah.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Looking for more audio-related podcasts to listen to? We're part of the Audio Podcast Alliance, featuring a hand-picked selection of the very best podcasts about sound. Be sure to hear the latest episodes from our friends in the community at audiopodcast.org. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting on patreon.com/fieldandfoley or ko-fi.com/fieldandfoley, where you gain early access to episodes in lossless format and can submit questions for our guests. Thank you for listening.